Noah's phone buzzed in his pocket just as he stepped out of his front door, the screen lighting up with a message from his neighbor, Karen. "The lights are out everywhere. Is your solar panel still working?" His heart dropped into his stomach. The blackout had arrived, just as he'd feared. The whole block was dark. No power, no sign of life. The neighborhood, usually filled with the low hum of air conditioners and television sets, was now eerily silent. The sky above was thick with clouds, heavy and swollen, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The storm was coming, but Noah was certain that wasn't the cause of the blackout. His solar panels installed months ago had been running smoothly, and he'd made sure they were connected to the grid. If anything could provide backup power during this kind of situation, it was supposed to be them. But now, they weren't working, and he knew why. He couldn't wait any longer. He stormed across the lawn, his boots crunching against the gravel driveway, heading straight for the one person he knew was responsible for this mess: Vanessa, the HOA president. The HOA had never liked the idea of him installing solar panels. They'd fought him at every turn, from demanding detailed design proposals to outright rejecting his installation requests. He had been insistent, filing appeals, and even suggesting a compromise. But Vanessa and her board had always found a way to block him. And now, his panels were down. Just as the blackout hit, Vanessa's house was a few doors down, and he could already see her standing on her porch, the light from her front door flickering as if on the brink of failing. The darkness around them seemed to make her pale face more pronounced, like a silhouette against the encroaching night. As he approached, she crossed her arms and leaned against the railing, a knowing smile creeping onto her lips. "Perfect timing," Vanessa called. "Out," her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You came to complain again." Noah didn't waste a second. He strode up to her, the words bursting from his chest before he could even think twice. "You did this. You sabotaged my solar panels, didn't you?" Vanessa let out a short, humorless laugh, taking a deliberate step forward. "Sabotaged? You're being paranoid." She waved him off, as if his accusations were the least of her concerns. But Noah could see through her casual dismissal. He could tell by the tightness in her eyes that she knew exactly what he was talking about. She had done something. He'd been dealing with her stubborn refusal for too long, and now he could feel the consequences of her actions in every darkened window of the neighborhood. "I'm not paranoid," Noah shot back, his fists clenched at his sides. "I had everything set up. The panels were fine until today, right before the blackout." He glared at her. What a coincidence. Vanessa leaned back against the doorframe, a cool detachment in her posture. "I told you, Noah, you're not putting solar panels on this block. You didn't listen to the rules. This isn't some experimental project you can push through just because you want to feel good about your carbon footprint." "I didn't ask for permission to do the right thing," Noah retorted. "You've been blocking everyone who tries to make a change around here. Just because you think it doesn't fit your little HOA-approved image doesn't mean you have the right to take it down. You think you can just control everything in this neighborhood?" Vanessa's face tightened, her usual confidence slipping. "Slightly, you can't just do whatever you want, Noah. You don't get to make your own rules because you think you know better." Noah's frustration bubbled over. But before he could say anything else, the lights inside Vanessa's house flickered. Then, for just a moment, they came back on. But within seconds, they were off again, just like the rest of the neighborhood. The sudden darkness seemed to draw a collective breath from the neighborhood. But Vanessa, for once, seemed unnerved. "Looks like your power's out too," Noah said, his voice low but sharp with satisfaction. He couldn't help it. There was a bit of triumph in seeing her finally get a taste of the same helplessness he'd felt for months. "You don't have your backup system, do you?" Vanessa looked at him with narrowed eyes, a slight tremor in her jaw. "What are you talking about? You've been so obsessed with shutting me down, but I've had my system running just fine. Your whole HOA wants to ignore clean energy, and now we're all in the dark because of it," Noah shot back. "The whole block could have been powered by my solar panels if you had just let me keep them up." Vanessa's expression twisted for a split second, and Noah caught it. There was panic beneath the anger, and for just a moment, it was clear she realized something. Then, from across the street, another neighbor shouted, "Power's out everywhere! Noah, what's going on?" Vanessa's mask cracked. We need to figure out what's wrong with the grid," she said quickly, trying to regain control. But Noah saw through her. The truth was there, plain as day. She had known all along that her decision to block alternative energy had consequences far beyond what she had let on. Noah didn't need to say anything else. He turned his back on her, heading for his house. But this time, he wasn't walking away in defeat. He was walking away with a plan. The blackout had just proven his point. His system could have worked, could have saved them, but now it was too late. The only thing Noah knew for sure was that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The sun had barely risen that morning, but Noah was already pacing in his kitchen, his mind racing. The mess Vanessa had caused was only the latest in a series of frustrations that had been building for months. Ever since he'd bought the house in Brookridge Summit, he'd been eager to do his part for the environment. His plan was simple: install solar panels, reduce his energy costs, and make a small but meaningful contribution to the planet. But Vanessa and the rest of the HOA had turned his simple idea into an impossible battle. He still remembered the first time he'd submitted his application to the HOA board. A week after moving in, the application had been straightforward: request for approval to install solar panels on the roof of his house. He had done his research, figured out exactly where the panels would go to ensure they were unobtrusive, and prepared a detailed presentation of how they could save money and energy for the entire neighborhood. He was excited, naive even, thinking that his logical, environmentally conscious decision would be welcomed with open arms. But Vanessa and the rest of the board had other ideas. "I'm sorry, Mr. Harper," Vanessa had said with a slight, condescending smile when they'd met to discuss his proposal, "but this isn't the aesthetic we want for our community." She glanced over his shoulder toward the neat rows of houses. "These panels are unsightly. They don't fit with the vision we have for Brookridge Summit." Noah had been taken aback. "But it's the future. Solar energy is the future." "We're not discussing the future. We're discussing our community standards," Vanessa had shot back. "The house will look better without them. It's about maintaining the value of the neighborhood." Noah had tried to argue that it wasn't just about appearances, that renewable energy was crucial for the environment, but Vanessa cut him off, offering a sharp, "It's not about what you want, Mr. Harper. It's about what's best for everyone." Her dismissive tone had left him frustrated, but he hadn't given up. He had gone home that night and started doing research, gathering data on solar energy, on other neighborhoods with solar panels, on how to appeal the HOA's decision. He knew there had to be a way around it. He was determined. He wasn't about to let some outdated rules keep him from doing what was right. A week later, he filed his formal appeal, sending an even more detailed plan outlining why solar panels were not only environmentally beneficial, but also economically smart. He included charts, studies, and even examples of other communities where solar energy was embraced. He thought, this time, surely they'd see reason. But Vanessa and her board, once again, rejected the proposal with a simple community standards excuse. It wasn't just about the panels anymore. It was about principle. They didn't have a good reason for rejecting his application other than their outdated and narrow-minded views, and he knew it. His frustration had grown with each rejection. He started questioning what was really going on behind the scenes. Why was the HOA so against it? What was the harm in letting him put up solar panels? But Noah didn't stop there. He wasn't one to give up easily, especially when he felt the weight of right and wrong on his side. He started digging deeper into the HOA's history, looking for any evidence of corruption or bias. What he uncovered shocked him. There were whispers, rumors circulating among residents that the HOA had been in bed with a local utility company. The company had been pushing to keep energy prices high, and Noah suspected they'd been pressuring the HOA to block any sort of alternative energy sources that could threaten their monopoly. But no one had ever spoken out. Everyone just accepted the status quo. That is, until now. Noah wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. As he pieced together the stories and hints of foul play, his mind raced with plans for how to expose the truth. He wasn't just fighting for his own solar panels anymore. He was fighting for the entire community. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about an eco-friendly project. It was about standing up against an entire system of control, manipulation, and greed. On his way to work one day, Noah passed a few other homes that had recently applied for solar panel installations, only to be shut down by the HOA. He stopped for a moment, his hand on the wheel of his car, contemplating what he had learned. Each rejection wasn't just personal, it was part of a bigger picture, one he was now a part of. A community stuck under the thumb of outdated rules. A community that could benefit from change, but was being kept in the dark. That night, Noah stayed up late, compiling his research. He created a folder full of evidence, notes, emails, news articles, testimonies from residents, and even a few confidential documents he had managed to uncover regarding the HOA's ties with the utility company. He knew he had something now, something powerful, and it was time to make it public. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, Noah was ready. He had his facts, his evidence, and his resolve. This wasn't just about a few solar panels. This was about exposing the truth, about shedding light on the corruption that had held his community back for far too long. He couldn't let them win. As he walked into the meeting room, he held his head high. He wasn't the naive new guy anymore. He was Noah Harper, and he wasn't backing down. Noah stood in front of his kitchen counter, staring at the stack of papers in front of him. Each document told a different piece of the same troubling story. He had been gathering evidence for weeks now, and with each new piece of information, his suspicions grew. What started as a personal fight over solar panels had quickly evolved into something much bigger. It wasn't just the HOA standing in his way, it was a system of corruption. One he was now determined to expose that all began, innocently enough. At first, Noah had assumed the HOA's resistance was just a matter of old-school thinking, an unwillingness to embrace change. He'd never been particularly fond of the HOA's overly strict rules, but he had never suspected that they were actively blocking progress for personal gain. His curiosity about why they were so dead set against solar panels had slowly morphed into a quiet investigation. He had to know if there was more to the story. It was on a random Tuesday afternoon, when Noah was walking his dog down the street, that he overheard a conversation between two longtime residents who lived a few doors down. They were sitting on Karen's front porch, sipping lemonade and talking in hushed voices. Noah, pretending to tie his dog's leash to a lamppost, caught a few words that made him stop dead in his tracks. "You heard about the new utility deal, right?" Karen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Vanessa and the others are getting kickbacks from the power company. That's why they're blocking solar panels." Steve glanced around nervously before replying. "I heard they're making a lot of money from keeping the energy prices high. They don't want people reducing their bills by using solar. That's why they've been rejecting every application." Noah's heart raced. He'd suspected there was something shady going on, but this was the confirmation he needed. The HOA's position on solar panels wasn't about aesthetics or community standards. It was about money. Vanessa and the board weren't just trying to maintain the neighborhood's look. They were protecting their financial interests, and they were willing to use their position to do so. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces started to fit together. The HOA had been rejecting his solar panel request with vague excuses about safety and design concerns. But every time he pushed back, they doubled down on their position. They had been using these excuses to cover up something much more sinister. The next few days, Noah dug deeper. He reached out to other residents who had faced similar issues with the HOA people who had tried to make their homes more energy efficient, only to be shot down by the board. He spoke to a few people who had applied for solar panels in the past, and their experiences mirrored his own. Vague rejections, evasive answers, and an overwhelming sense that they weren't being told the full truth. It was when he spoke to Jim, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for nearly 40 years, that things started to come into sharper focus. Jim had seen the HOA at its worst. He'd been part of the community before Vanessa had taken charge, and he had watched as things had changed over the years. "The HOA was never this bad before," Jim explained, his voice low, as if he were sharing a secret. "Back when I first moved in, the board actually cared about the community. But that all changed when Vanessa took over. She started bringing in new board members, all of them with ties to the power company. I don't know all the details, but it's clear they've got some deal going on behind closed doors." Noah's mind raced. The pieces were coming together, but they still didn't make sense. If Vanessa and the HOA were making money from the energy company, why had they allowed him to install his panels in the first place? Why hadn't they stopped him sooner? That's when the realization hit him. They hadn't known about the panels until it was too late. He'd gotten everything approved through a loophole. His initial approval was nothing more than a formality. They never thought he would actually follow through with the installation. But when they saw his panels up and running, they panicked. The system was designed to protect their interests, not encourage competition. The moment they realized his solar panels could actually work, could save him money and lower his dependence on the power grid, they had moved swiftly to shut it down. Noah felt a surge of anger at the manipulation and greed he was discovering. He wasn't just fighting for his panels anymore, he was fighting for his entire community. These people, the ones who had sworn to protect the neighborhood and its residents, had been doing the exact opposite. They weren't just blocking solar panels, they were protecting a system that kept everyone dependent on high energy bills and outdated power sources. But Noah wasn't going to let this stand. He had come too far to back down now. He had evidence, he had support, and he had the moral high ground. It was time to take action. The more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about exposing Vanessa's corruption. It was about fighting for the future of Brookridge Summit. He began compiling his findings, emails between board members and representatives from the utility company, notes from residents who had been intimidated into silence, and records of inflated energy prices that seemed to correlate with the HOA's actions. The more he gathered, the clearer the picture became. The HOA wasn't just blocking solar panels, they were actively working to keep the community in the dark. No one knew he was up against a powerful system, but the weight of truth was on his side. He had to expose the truth, no matter the cost. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that if he didn't act now, the entire neighborhood would continue to suffer under Vanessa's rule. The fight had just begun, and he was ready. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening, and Noah could feel the weight of the upcoming confrontation in his chest. He had spent the last several days preparing, gathering all the evidence he had accumulated about Vanessa and the board's connections to the utility company. It was time to lay it all on the table. He wasn't walking into that meeting as the disillusioned newcomer anymore. He was walking in as someone who knew the truth, someone who had proof. He arrived early, his heart pounding with anticipation. As he entered the community center, the small, musty room immediately felt suffocating. The usual crowd was already there, many of them familiar faces who had quietly accepted the HOA's control over the years. Most were older residents who hadn't asked questions, content with the established order. Noah noticed a few of them casting wary glances at him as he took his seat. They knew he'd been at odds with the board for months, but tonight felt different. Vanessa was all ready. At the head of the room, seated behind the long wooden table, her eyes flicked to Noah as he entered, but she didn't acknowledge him. Instead, she began reviewing a few papers in front of her, preparing for the meeting to start. The other board members were scattered throughout the room, seated in the same stiff, indifferent posture they always had. Noah's eyes narrowed as he took his place. He could feel the tension in the air. Tonight wasn't going to be business as usual. The moment the meeting began, Noah knew he had to make his move. "Let's begin." Vanessa's voice echoed through the room, and the quiet murmur of conversations died away. As the meeting went on, Noah could feel his nerves tightening, but he was ready. He had his folder with all the evidence, emails, utility contracts, testimonies from residents, and even photos that showed the discrepancies in the HOA's claims. Vanessa started talking about community guidelines, her usual rhetoric about maintaining the neighborhood's charm and safety. But Noah wasn't going to let that slide. "Excuse me," Noah interjected, his voice calm but firm. The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at him. Vanessa's expression faltered for just a second, but she quickly regained her composure. "Yes, Mr. Harper?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock politeness. "I've been hearing a lot of talk about community guidelines, but I don't think anyone here has had a real discussion about what's actually going on behind the scenes," Noah said, his gaze steady as he looked around the room. "There's been a lot of secrecy and a lot of rejection when it comes to solar panels, and I think it's time the truth came out." Vanessa's face tightened, but she didn't interrupt. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Sensing the shift in the room, Noah opened his folder and laid the papers out in front of him. "I've gathered evidence of the HOA's ties to the local utility company. I have documents showing that the board including you, Vanessa, have been actively discouraging the use of renewable energy in this neighborhood. Not because it's unsafe, not because it doesn't fit the community's aesthetic, but because you're personally benefiting from maintaining the status quo. He held up one of the contracts he had found, pointing to the highlighted sections. Here it is, a deal between the HOA and the utility company that guarantees higher energy prices in exchange for cooperation. A murmur rippled through the room. Noah could see the fear on some of the residents' faces as the realization began to settle in. They were starting to understand the depth of the corruption. Vanessa stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger. "That's a lie," she shouted, slamming her hands onto the table. "This is completely unfounded, Mr. Harper. You're trying to discredit the board with lies and baseless accusations." Noah didn't flinch. He was prepared for this. "If it were a lie, Vanessa, then why haven't you allowed a single resident to install solar panels? Why have you rejected every application without offering any real explanation? And why is the utility company's name all over your paperwork? This isn't about community standards. It's about money. You're protecting your own interests, not the interests of this neighborhood." The room was silent now, and Noah could see some of the board members shifting in their seats. Vanessa's mask of control was starting to slip. "You have no right to accuse us of this," Vanessa spat. "I've worked hard for this community, and I've made decisions that benefit everyone here." "Then why are so many people paying inflated utility bills?" Noah asked, leaning forward. "Why are so many people afraid to speak up because they know they'll be targeted by the HOA? You've been using your position to control this community and profit from it." The tension in the room was palpable. Some of the older residents, those who had always trusted the HOA, were beginning to look uncomfortable. But it wasn't just Vanessa they were looking at now. It was the rest of the board, too. They had been complicit in this, and Noah knew it. One by one, Noah pointed out the specific actions of each board member. He showed the community how their interests aligned with the utility companies, how their inaction on solar energy and their aggressive control over the neighborhood had been part of a larger, unethical scheme. "I'm not here to destroy the HOA," Noah said, his voice cutting through the tension. "I'm here to expose the truth. And the truth is that this community deserves better. We deserve transparency, we deserve fair access to renewable energy, and we deserve to know that the people in charge of our neighborhood aren't lining their pockets at our expense." Vanessa's face had gone pale, and she was visibly shaking with rage, but Noah could see the cracks forming. The truth was undeniable. The board's grip on the neighborhood was weakening, and it was only a matter of time before the community rallied behind him. Noah's words hung in the air like a challenge. There was no going back now. He had just turned the tide, but he knew the battle was far from over. The board wouldn't give up easily. They would fight back with everything. They had, but Noah wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The war for Brookridge Summit had only just begun. The week after the HOA meeting, Noah barely slept. His mind buzzed with the weight of what had happened and what still needed to be done. The confrontation at the meeting had been a victory in some ways, but it had also marked the beginning of a more dangerous phase in his fight. He knew the HOA wasn't going to fold easily. Vanessa and the board would retaliate, and this time they'd do everything in their power to crush him. But Noah wasn't about to let them intimidate him. He had done the groundwork, laid out his case. The evidence he had gathered wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. He now had the missing pieces he needed to bring down the HOA's corrupt system. Late one evening, Noah sat at his kitchen table, sifting through stacks of documents, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. The papers in front of him weren't just about his solar panels anymore. They were about exposing the entire network of deceit that had been keeping the neighborhood in the dark, literally and figuratively. Vanessa's ties to the utility company were just the tip of the iceberg. There were deeper connections, deeper conflicts of interest that Noah hadn't even fully understood until now. He leaned back in his chair, trying to put everything together. He had a folder full of incriminating emails between the HOA and the local utility company. But what struck him most were the signed contracts that had surfaced during his research agreements that made it clear the HOA was actively working with the utility to block any form of competition that would reduce their monopoly. They had been profiting from the higher energy rates in the neighborhood, funneling kickbacks into their pockets while residents paid the price. The realization hit Noah like a ton of bricks. It wasn't just about blocking solar panels. It was about maintaining control of the neighborhood's energy supply. If people were allowed to install solar, it would break the stranglehold the utility company and the HOA had over Brookridge Summit. He stood up, pacing the room, trying to piece together the full extent of the conspiracy. It wasn't just one or two shady figures, it was a web of corruption. The utility company had been inflating energy bills for years, and the HOA had been in on it every step of the way. Vanessa and her colleagues were leveraging their power over the community to secure financial gains, all at the expense of the residents. The more Noah dug into the documents, the more he understood the lengths to which the HOA had gone to protect their arrangement with the utility company in exchange for rejecting solar panel installations and blocking any form of competition. The HOA was receiving substantial financial incentives. The HOA had signed off on utility rate hikes, effectively keeping the residents locked into overpriced energy contracts that benefited the very people in power. Noah's head spun. This was worse than he could have ever imagined. These weren't just a few shady decisions. This was systemic corruption. The entire community had been taken advantage of for years, and it was all hidden in plain sight, covered by the thin veil of community standards and aesthetic guidelines. But there was one thing he hadn't expected. As he combed through the final batch of documents, he discovered an even more shocking piece of information. One of the signatures on the utility company's contracts was familiar. It was the signature of Karen, the same neighbor who had spoken so freely about the HOA's dealings with the utility company during their conversation. She had been part of the agreement, a silent partner in the corruption. Noah sat back in his chair, his heart pounding. Karen, the same person who had warned him about the HOA's connections, had been complicit in it all along. She wasn't just an innocent bystander, she was an insider, part of the very system that had been exploiting the community. This was the moment he realized just how deep the corruption ran. It wasn't just Vanessa and her board. It was a network of residents and HOA members who had been working together for years to maintain control, all while pretending to be the guardians of the neighborhood's best interests. Noah knew what he had to do. The next step was crucial. He couldn't just sit back and let this slide any longer. He needed to expose the truth to show the rest of the neighborhood just how deeply they had been lied to and taken advantage of. But this wasn't going to be easy. If the HOA found out he had uncovered these hidden documents, they would stop at nothing to silence him. Noah took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He made copies of the most incriminating evidence, the utility contracts, the emails, the proof of the kickbacks, and tucked them into an envelope. He couldn't risk keeping them in his house. If the HOA found out, they'd be gone in an instant. Instead, he took the envelope and drove to a nearby storage locker. He rented a space, knowing he'd need somewhere secure to keep everything. Until he was ready to act, that night, Noah couldn't help but feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. The stakes had never been higher. But he wasn't afraid anymore. He had the truth on his side, and he wasn't about to let anyone, least of all Vanessa and her cronies, continue to manipulate and exploit the neighborhood for their own gain. He spent the next few days quietly gathering support. He reached out to the residents who had spoken to him about their frustrations, the ones who had been afraid to stand up to the HOA. He showed them the evidence and explained everything he had uncovered. One by one, they joined his cause, realizing that they too had been kept in the dark. There was strength in numbers, and with every person who came forward, Noah knew he was one step closer to bringing the HOA's web of deceit to light. The quiet war he had been fighting for months was about to become public. Noah had no intention of backing down now. He wasn't just fighting for solar panels anymore. He was fighting for the future of his entire community. And this time, the truth was going to win. Noah woke up the morning after he had secured the last piece of evidence, his stomach churning with anticipation. Today was the day. The day he was going to expose the HOA's corruption to the world. The moment he had worked toward for months had finally arrived, and now he had to be ready for the fallout. There was no turning back. He had already contacted the local news station. His plan was simple: release the documents, show the community the truth, and let the rest fall into place. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he couldn't allow this system to continue. Vanessa and the board had used their power to manipulate, control, and profit at the expense of everyone in Brookridge Summit. It was time for them to face the consequences. By mid-morning, Noah had gathered a small group of neighbors at his house, people who had been quietly supportive of him, but who were too afraid to speak out on their own. He could feel the tension. In the room, they were nervous, unsure of what the backlash would be, but they all knew one thing: they couldn't allow the HOA to get away with this any longer. "I know this is risky," Noah began, standing in front of them, "but we can't just keep letting them control us. What we've uncovered isn't just about solar panels anymore. It's about everything. We've been kept in the dark for too long. Our energy bills are through the roof because of them, and they've been lining their pockets while we've been suffering." The room was silent for a moment. Then Karen, the neighbor who had given Noah the first hint about the HOA's dealings, spoke up. "I'm with you, Noah," she said, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "I've seen how they've treated people in this neighborhood. You're right, it's not just about the solar panels, it's about us, the residents, being taken advantage of." Noah nodded. "I'm not doing this alone. We all have to stick together. The more of us who speak up, the harder it will be for them to silence us." By that afternoon, the news station had scheduled an interview. Noah sat in the living room, watching the footage of his face on TV as the station's anchor began reading the statement he had sent in. The anchor introduced the segment, giving a brief overview of the ongoing conflict in Brookridge Summit. Noah's stomach twisted. He wasn't prepared for the weight of the words that were being broadcast to the entire community. The segment opened with footage of Noah standing in front of the HOA building, holding the documents he had uncovered. The camera zoomed in on the signed contracts and emails that revealed the collusion between the HOA and the utility company, the corrupt financial deals that had kept energy prices inflated for years, and the deliberate blocking of renewable energy solutions. Vanessa's face appeared in the footage next, her stern expression frozen in time from a previous HOA meeting. Her voice echoed through the speakers, still denying any wrongdoing. But the truth was now out there, and her denials seemed hollow. The documents spoke for themselves. As the broadcast continued, Noah's heart raced. He could already imagine the chaos this would cause. People were waking up to the truth, and they weren't going to let the HOA get away with this anymore. When the segment ended, Noah's phone immediately lit up with messages. His neighbors were texting, calling, and posting on social media. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. People were finally starting to speak up. Some shared their own stories of trying to install solar panels, while others talked about their rising energy bills and the ongoing frustration with the HOA's control over the neighborhood. It seemed like the floodgates had opened, and people were no longer afraid to challenge the status quo. But there were also messages of anger. Some residents, loyal to Vanessa and the HOA, lashed out at Noah, accusing him of trying to destroy the neighborhood. The backlash came swiftly: threats of legal action, attempts to discredit him, and furious calls from those who felt the HOA had done nothing wrong. Vanessa's supporters were out in full force, trying to shift the narrative. They were scared that their grip on the neighborhood was slipping. The HOA's retaliation came the following day. When Vanessa called an emergency meeting, the room was packed with residents, some of them furious at what Noah had done. Others in shock, unsure of what to think. Vanessa stood at the front, trying to hold her composure. But there was a tremor in her voice when she spoke. "This is an attack on this community," she said, her voice rising. "These accusations are baseless. Mr. Harper has taken something that was meant to be a private matter and made it public. This is slander." Noah, standing at the back of the room, stood tall. "This is about the truth, Vanessa. This is about the people of Brookridge Summit finally having a voice. We've been held in the dark for too long, and I won't let you manipulate us anymore." The room was divided. Some were on his side, their anger bubbling over now that they saw the truth, while others still clung to the belief that Vanessa had their best interests at heart. But the division was clear. Now the community was no longer united under the HOA's control. People were questioning everything, from the HOA's motives to the utility company's practices. The truth was out, and it was causing a ripple effect. That couldn't be stopped. As the meeting wore on, the tension in the room mounted. Vanessa attempted to regain control, but her words were falling on deaf ears. The momentum was shifting, And Noah knew the battle was far from over. The HOA would fight back harder than ever, but the truth had taken root, and the community was starting to question their authority. In the days that followed, Noah saw more residents coming forward, supporting his cause. The media coverage continued to grow, and with it, the pressure on the HOA, a public investigation into their dealings, was now inevitable. The HOA had made a grave mistake in trying to suppress the truth, and now they were on the defensive. For Noah, the road ahead was still uncertain. He didn't know how far the HOA would go to protect themselves or how much damage they could do. But one thing was clear: the people of Brookridge Summit were no longer afraid. They were waking up, and with Noah leading the charge, they were ready to fight for their neighborhood, their future, and their right to be free from corruption. The fallout had begun, but it was only a matter of time before the storm would come. To an end, and the truth would finally reign. It had been weeks since the community's first public confrontation with the HOA, and things had only intensified. The fallout from Noah's expose had spread like wildfire. There were articles, interviews, social media posts, and public forums where residents were discussing the deep-seated corruption that had controlled their neighborhood for years. The HOA had tried everything to quell the uprising, from sending threatening letters to rallying their loyalists, but the tide had turned. Noah stood outside his house one crisp Saturday morning, looking at the street that had been his home for over a year. The streets were quieter than usual, but today it felt different. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a sense of change. The battle he had started was nearing its conclusion, and no matter how hard Vanessa and her board tried to control the situation, the community was no longer afraid. A large crowd had gathered in the local park for a final town hall meeting. The city council had agreed to investigate the HOA's dealings with the utility company, and there was a palpable sense of optimism. Residents from every corner of Brookridge Summit were showing up, eager to take back control of their neighborhood. Noah was there early, as usual, meeting with residents who had once felt powerless but now stood united under a common cause. He caught sight of Karen, who had been one of his earliest supporters. She was standing near the front, talking to some of the other neighbors. Her face was no longer the nervous, cautious one he had seen when they first spoke. She looked different, now stronger, more confident. She was no longer the quiet resident who had been afraid to speak up. She had found her voice, just like the rest of them. Noah took a deep breath and walked toward the crowd. The town hall meeting was about to begin, and he could feel the collective energy of the group. They were ready. They weren't just there to listen, they were there to make their voices heard. As Noah entered the park's pavilion, he could see the community center had been transformed. The room was filled with residents, all eager to hear what the city council and local officials had to say. Vanessa was sitting at the front, her face drawn tight, her usually confident demeanor slipping beneath the weight of her own guilt. It was clear that the battle she thought she'd won was slipping through her fingers. The town hall began, and the council members spoke about the ongoing investigation into the HOA's financial dealings. They had uncovered more than Noah had ever hoped for. The public outcry had forced the utility company to open its doors to scrutiny, and the ties between the HOA board and the company had been exposed. It wasn't just about solar panels, it was about greed, exploitation, and systemic corruption. When the council members finished speaking, Noah was invited to address the crowd. As he stood at the podium, he felt a surge of gratitude, not just for himself, but for everyone who had joined the fight. The community had come together, united by the truth and the realization that their voices could make a difference. He looked out over the crowd, and for a moment he felt a profound sense of purpose. "This isn't just about solar panels," he began, his voice steady. "It's about the power we have to make our own choices. For too long, we've been controlled by a system that told us how to live, what to believe, and what we could or couldn't do. But today, we've shown that we have the strength to fight for what's right." The crowd erupted in applause, and Noah continued, "This neighborhood belongs to all of us, not just to those who hold the power behind closed doors. And today, we take that power back. We fight for transparency, for fairness, and for a future where we can make our own decisions." Vanessa shifted uncomfortably in her seat as the crowd's energy surged. She had no words, no defenses left. The truth had already done its work. Over the next few weeks, the investigation into the HOA's practices began to take shape. The evidence Noah had gathered was undeniable, and with public pressure mounting, the HOA board was forced to step down. New leadership was elected, and the community finally took control of its future. The utility company was investigated for its role in manipulating the HOA, and several executives faced charges for their involvement in the corruption. The energy prices in the neighborhood were reviewed and adjusted, with residents finally receiving the fair rates they had long deserved. For Noah, it was a bittersweet victory. He had exposed the truth, and the community had rallied around it. But the scars of the battle remained. People's lives had been impacted, their trust had been broken, and it would take time to rebuild what had been lost. But the victory was undeniable. The neighborhood had reclaimed its power. As Noah stood in front of his house that evening, looking out at the quiet streets, he realized that this wasn't just about solar panels or the HOA. It was about something far more important, the right to have a voice in the decisions that affect your life, and the power to stand up when something is wrong. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood. Noah thought about the future. It was uncertain, yes, but for the first time in a long while, it felt full of possibility. He had done more than just expose corruption. He had inspired a community to stand together and fight for what was right. And that, he realized, was the real victory. The battle had been hard, and the road ahead would still be challenging. But Noah knew one thing for sure. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. The fight for justice, for fairness, had become a movement. And together, they had won.